Right. So this is our Ask the Monk series. This is our first series wherein we are trying to decode technology, trying to help recruiters get a hang of technology by demystifying different roles. So in this particular episode, we are trying to get a hang of DevOps as a role, right? Trying to understand what DevOps is because I see that there's a lot of ambiguity when it comes to understanding DevOps as a role amongst the recruiters, and this will help us to get some clarity on the role and will help us do our hiring better once understand the job descriptions better and the resumes, obviously understand the resumes better, right? And this will help us have a good contextual engagement with both the hiring manager and the candidates, right? So I believe this discussion will help lot many recruiters out there who have tuned in now. So thanks for everyone who has tuned into this. Okay, let me welcome the guest for today's event. It is Ravi, right? We are glad to have Ravi here. Ravi is an evangelist who works at Harness. Some of you might be knowing Harness is one of a good product firm. Some of you who are into product hiring, I think, would be aware of Harness. They've done their recent, I think, Series B or Series C funding they've gone with recently, right? So people who've been run the business, I think you guys would know this. And what Ravi does there is Ravi focuses specifically on the cloud native and the CI/CD space. Previous to this, Ravi has worked with App Dynamics. He has worked with Mesosphere, which is more on the microservice front, right? And he has worked with Red Hat, Deloitte kind of companies, wherein he has been in different roles ranging from engineer, solution architect, technology sales, right? So and mostly he's played a key role in the ops side of it, DevOps side, and also interestingly, he runs a community for DevOps, right? And the way I bounced on Ravi's profile, I'll tell you, it would be interesting. I found someone sharing an article on DevOps versus SRE, kind of an article, I think, which Ravi wrote it sometime recently. And then I bounced that article on LinkedIn. And then that article was very interesting and that gave a lot much clarity in terms of what this role is and stuff. And then I was like, okay, who wrote this article? And then I ended up stalking Ravi's profile on LinkedIn. And then I thought, okay, he's the right guy who would help us get some clarity on this role. So Ravi, welcome you for this event. Thanks that you've taken time for this.
Yeah, absolutely excited to be here and happy to answer any questions. And yeah, thanks everybody for hearing me talk late in your evening. So thanks for lining it up.
Yeah. So Ravi, before we get into DevOps, one lighter question, right? What I just want to understand. I understand your roots maybe from India. What is that your surname? Is it like Lakshman, which turned into be Lachman? Sorry, I cannot pronounce.
Yeah. My family, we're from British Guyana, so we're Guyanese. So like, just Indian diaspora. Like it's Lakshman, but Aji Aja, like they couldn't read or write when they were taken by the British to Guyana, so like they didn't know how to write the name. So it's funny. My family last name is spelled like 4 different ways depending which brother my dad's side it is. So yeah.
Okay, nice. So yep. So Ravi, so just like wanted to start the discussion with one very simple question, and right, that question is around DevOps. What exactly is DevOps? Because this term DevOps or a role as DevOps was not there a few years back, right? This is something which has been buzzing off late, right? What exactly this role is? Can you help us get a slightly like a overview of this?
Yeah, absolutely. DevOps, DevOps at the definition of it, it's not a set of skills. It's actually a cultural movement. And so if you kind of take a look at what it takes to get software into the hands of the end users, there's usually the word is 2 words, right? Development and operations. And so if you go back several years, it's the ability to get your ideas into production was 2 different camps. You'd have the developers writing features, and then you have the operations folks either deploying it and also making sure they run. But we have 2 separate goals. I've worked both sets of jobs before. So as a developer or software engineer, I was paid on building a feature. But as an operations engineer, you're paid on stability. So if you introduce change, it's making something unstable. So people who want to make the change versus people who don't really want to make the change. And so this term DevOps is more of a cultural shift. And so bringing both sides of the parties together, a more formal definition now saying that it's a cultural thing, a more formal definition would be bringing both sides of the table together and also breaking down barriers and silos. So a DevOps engineer typically focuses on automation. They focus on something called the development pipeline. So the entire journey that it takes from a software engineer to go from the idea in his or her head to all the way to the end user in production. They focus on building out automation that facilitates that. And so that's typically what a DevOps engineer does. Usually, every organization will categorize DevOps as different. The reason why it's becoming so popular is because there's this rise in agile development that engineers and companies want to move faster, but they can move only so fast that eventually they have to get to production. But a big detriment to getting to production would be all the confidence building, all the testing. And so as a DevOps engineer, you help facilitate automation around that.
Okay, so if I've understood it right, it is more like the process, more like the agile way of how getting things done. So DevOps is more on the technical side of how the entire development process can be done, right? It's more of a practice or a process.
Yeah, they're the DevOps engineer or DevOps organization. They're bringing in that change, right? So they're working with multiple stakeholders. They're really looking for help automation, also making things more consistent, right? So as I'll give you a more of an anecdote why it's so important. So in my career, I've probably been on over a dozen development teams. So I've changed, I've been on a dozen different teams, and most of my background's been in Java. But as a software engineer, I can take Java with me place to place, but every single team I was ever on, we deployed. So that means how do we actually install the software, right? If you're not familiar, like how do we get it to somewhere that's running? No, we never did the same. Every one of my teams did it differently. And so that's a big part of the learning curve, right? As a software engineer, there's a big, even though I was a principal engineer at one point, like it was still a big learning curve for me, even the 12th team I was on. Versus now the DevOps engineers, they focus on making that ubiquitous throughout the organizations. They've helped make a better developer experience. And so it wouldn't matter what team I was on, I would have a consistent way of going to production. So that's kind of like in a nutshell what a DevOps engineer would do.
Okay, awesome. Now you were talking about different companies have different way of putting across what DevOps is, or maybe defining the role as a DevOps. Can you help us understand why is that difference there, and as the recruiters, what we should do to understand what exactly they are looking for?
Yeah, and it's really critical, right? Like as a hiring manager myself, right? So like it really comes back to some of the core tenets of being a recruiter. You really have to understand where your customer, or let that be the hiring manager or organization that you represent, like why are they hiring? It can be, there's a big spectrum when it comes to DevOps. It can be the core tenet why, like, hey, help me understand, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, why are you hiring? What are some core goals of hiring a DevOps engineer? Because there's a wide spectrum. Going from the most basic, they're looking for a system admin again, right? So they're just repackaging the role to get more candidates. Like, oh yeah, we're just focusing on building infrastructure, and so we just need another system engineer. But to get a candidate, because there's an aura of that, a DevOps engineer gets a higher pay rate, right? If you take a look at any sort of, like, it comes down to money at some point, right? You're able to attract more candidates by saying it's a DevOps job because there's a notion that DevOps jobs pay more than, let's say, a system engineering job or a development job. Like, it's kind of, you have to transcend both. So the candidate will say, you know what, it's better for my career because I can get a higher hourly rate, I can get more annual salary. And so it's understanding why the hiring manager's hiring. Are they hiring because for the right reasons? How you can really pull them apart, saying, okay, like, is it a cultural transformation you're running? Is there a reason why you're hiring a net new DevOps engineer? Are you hiring the first DevOps engineer? Are you hiring the 100th DevOps engineer? And so having that kind of background of like why they're hiring and the motivations to hire would be, it's like any other thing you're recruiting for. Like, motivation it's big to see why the hiring manager is hiring.
Okay, can you give us maybe 2 or 3 scenarios on why they are hiring? One, I think during the conversation you did mention like they might be hiring like a system admin, a guy more focused towards the infrastructure, right? Like this, can you give us maybe broadly 2-3 scenarios on what kind of maybe DevOps guy they might be looking for? Maybe 2-3 scenarios.
Yeah. So if you're like looking for hard skills, like like the most I say generic would be like they're looking for infrastructure automation. So what that means is in today's day and age, you're not just dealing with like one computer, right? Like or one box. You're dealing with thousands or hundreds of thousands because of what the public cloud has offered, or even internal cloud. So like you typically would have more than one place, and so infrastructure provisioning means how do you set up those machines? How do you get the required software on them? Because again, from a development standpoint, I don't care where it runs. It's like it needs to run somewhere. And so it's up to the operations teams to figure out, okay, we need this much capacity. And so they would have to be building out the automation infrastructure. If you take it back 20 years ago, most of the provisioning, let's say you needed a new server, right? Like a new computer. It's no different than the exercise that anybody on the call would have went through when you get a new laptop. It's like you got to download things, click on things. But that doesn't scale because a typical, company will have tens of thousands of machines. Can you imagine how long that would take? So they focus on infrastructure automation. Other part of the spectrum, that's more the ops side. You might go to the complete other side, and you're actually focusing on the development side. So a very textbook definition of a DevOps engineer is a ops system engineer focusing on development problems. And so what is the difference between a developer and a system engineer? So a system engineer focuses on scale and uptime and what we call non-functional requirements. So if we were building this, an iPhone, right? Like a functional requirement would be we have a calculator. The non-functional requirement is only Ravi has access to the calculator, right? So it's a security thing. So that's where the difference is. Because of it's a split brain problem. A development-focused DevOps engineer would be more focused on the development pipeline. So this concept called buzzwords here, CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and this is what Harness specifically, like my firm specifically focuses on solving that problem. They'll focus on that, right? So how do you build the software? How do you package the software? How do you deploy the software? Versus in more infrastructure-centric, let's make sure that the infrastructure is there for when it's time to install, it's ready, versus someone who's actually focusing on the pipeline. I know it's interesting to be on with recruiters because a common point of making fun at is that DevOps job descriptions are so broad that it's actually I would joke with other people like this is an entire IT department. Like there's no one person who knows all these skill sets. Like I might know half of it. I've been working for 15 years, at up until a principal engineer or even a senior manager or director now, right? So it's like, how does one person know all of this? And that's usually like, we can talk about that. Like, if you see the job descriptions are so wide, like they need to focus on what's the most important. That's kind of a common thing I see with DevOps job descriptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if I have to reiterate what you just mentioned in terms of DevOps, so one is it is more focused on the ops side, which is on the infrastructure. That is one set of job descriptions, and another set of job descriptions is more focused towards the dev side. And then the third category, which is a mix of both, wherein you expect someone to know both dev and ops, right? Okay, cool. That gives us good clarity in terms of how to differentiate job descriptions. And I think reading through the KRAs would help, right? Rather than just reading the skills. What do you suggest if a recruiter is looking at a job description, trying to understand what are the KRAs would help rather than just looking at what kind of skills is required? What is your suggestion there?
Did you say key areas?
KRAs, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I would say it's like any job description. So you put it right back in the hiring manager. The job is so to get so for example, let's say you're trying to recruit me, right? So it's more about getting the person excited about the problem. So I'll give you an engineering, like as a engineering hiring manager, how I position my job descriptions and how I look for candidates. So this might be helpful to get into the mind of on the other side of the table.
Yeah.
So typically, the job needs to be interesting for an engineer, right? It needs to be interesting. Like just saying you'd be working with these technologies is not interesting. In fact, I find it pretty. Now, again, not trying to offend anybody on the call. I probably get hit up by a recruiter 2 to 3 times a day, every day, and for me to go work somewhere else. And most of them I just pass it off. Like what is it in it for me, right? Like like oh Java and Jenkins and this like we have a good role for you. Like he didn't tell me anything. He just told me a list of skills in the city. Like I have a family, like where are we gonna go, right? Like yeah. So it's getting people excited. Like hey, like people get excited about the domain they're solving for. Let's just say I don't know, I'm making up some companies like Reliance, right? The cell phone company. Like, why are we solving this particular problem here? And having that in the job description. So when I write job descriptions, I talk about the problems that we're trying to solve and how it impacts people. Then also when looking to candidates, well, I'll clearly out a list like these are the skills that are nice to have. These are skills that we can teach you. No one person's going to have all the skills. If I had a 100% skill match for myself, I would never change my job because it's like I'm not learning. Like, why would I? Like, for money? Sure, I could get more money, but like, why would I move if I'm not learning any more skills? And so this is a little bit above the question. Usually, if you had to go coach a hiring manager, like trying to convince somebody to hire somebody, my success is if the person knows at least 60% of the skills, they're a good fit because they know enough that they can do the job, and also there's a lot for them to learn, so they could climb to it. Versus if they only know 10%, they won't be successful, right? Or if they know too much, they'll be bored. And so it's just finding that right tune. So I try to unpack a lot, have the hiring manager be more inspirational that we need these 6 skill sets because they're clearly not.
I think by now most of the recruiters would be amazed, or maybe they might be smiling because hey, did he say that he will hire if there's a 60% match? Because they expect, okay, where are the hiring managers like this? Where are hiring managers like Ravi out there? Because for the kind of hiring managers I work with, the hiring manager expects 100 out of 100. Did he just 60%? Right? So he's like, okay, where is Ravi? Right? I want hiring managers like Ravi to work with. So yeah, so
maybe the culture of hiring is different,
right? So basically the kind of expectations which hiring managers have also plays a role here, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So moving ahead, can you help us understand the difference between DevOps versus SRE versus build and release?
Yeah, and so a lot of these terms have been coming up. They're definitely different disciplines. So the eldest of those disciplines is build and release. So it's funny. The build and release engineers are harder to come by because they just simply don't exist very many places anymore. 10 or 15 years ago, building software, it took a long time, right? So we would have different development methodologies. Some of them might be agile looking, some of them were waterfall. And you have a lot of people on the team who didn't actually write features, right? So I remember my very first roll out of school, I was a product engineer for IBM. Our team was probably 15 people. I was one of like 4 people who wrote the features. And then the other people were either they were doing testing, or they were doing build and release, or they were doing packaging, or they were doing something else. I don't even know what the other, like how they interacted with the team for that. But it used to take a lot. The people who wrote the software didn't build the software, or the people who wrote the software didn't package it, right? So we were very, very siloed. Like we make what we only need to make, and then someone else has a discipline. But because of that, the hands-offs were like, clearly they're 2 different sets of skills. But as the motion for agility and developing smaller features, so instead of releasing the software all at once, been throwing this word around, agile, you release little tiny pieces at a time, so you get feedback. So instead of producing the big piece and then all at once, you release something and then you make little changes all the time. That's been how software has changed the last 15 years. And so to support that, there's a whole lot of automation. Imagine having to work with a build and release engineer every single time. You have to deploy every 2 weeks. That person will quit. You will quit too, because it can take weeks to deploy something. And this is where the DevOps and SRE movements come up. Now, what I call these two roles, a DevOps engineer and an SRE. And there's other roles like that. They're actually expertise roles. And so typically, there's not a DevOps engineer on every development team. And typically, there's not a site, so SRE means site reliability engineer. There's typically not an SRE on every development team because typically those people cost more and their skill sets are harder to find. And so usually like one DevOps engineer might represent 10 to 15 development teams. Same thing with an SRE. One SRE might be handling 10 to 15 different teams because they're expertise roles, such as an AppSec engineer, such as a security engineer, such as a performance engineer. Their knowledge is leveraged throughout the organization. And that's why they cost more, and that's why they're harder to find because it's a very specialized skill set. Now, going back to the heart of your question, the difference between a DevOps and an SRE, something I'm very passionate about. Going back to the definition of a DevOps engineer, a DevOps engineer is a system engineer focused on the development pipeline. Transversely, a site reliability engineer is a software engineer focused on operational problems. So they have two different lenses. So what does it mean to be a software engineer focused on an operational problem? So just like the definition of the title is a site reliability engineer, focusing on the end, reliability engineer. Reliability can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, right? Like in modern times, in 2021, as consumers, it boiled into the enterprise that we have a expectation of always available. Because of this thing, again, your cell phone or I call it the consumerization of enterprise apps that as consumers, we have the same expectation at work, right? Like always available, no matter what it is, needs to be easy to use. And so a site reliability engineer focuses on scaling, uptime, robustness. Again, going back as a software engineer, I might not be an expert in scale. I'm an expert in writing a feature. If we have, let's say a new popular application came up or, something has to scale very quickly, that's not whose expertise is it? It's not my expertise. It's probably not a system engineer's expertise because he or she only knows how to add more, right? Adding more is always not the right way to do it. The SRE will focus on proper ways of scaling, proper ways of making up uptime. So they're helping me as a software engineer focus on writing a feature, and they're worrying about something called technical debt to make sure that I don't introduce something that we would have to fix in the future. They're providing expertise saying, hey, Ravi, don't do it like this. Or, you know what, the platform that you've chosen has a theoretical limit. We're gonna run into an issue. Or the more romanticized idea of an SRE is when there's a production outage or an issue, they go in and try to fix things. Is actually their job is not to fix, their job is to remedy. There's a difference. So if let's say the website's down, something's slow, they can help make sure that the end users aren't impacted, but the underlying cause goes back to the engineering team to fix. So long-winded answer, development pipeline, the DevOps engineer, uptime and performance, the SRE.
Okay. Sometimes is it not overlapping that a DevOps guy also takes care of the scalability, the uptime and stuff, right? Isn't it overlapping sometimes?
It depends on the firm. This goes back to your job description is too wide, or who on earth has all these skill sets, right? There certainly is overlap because the skill sets it just shows where the focus is. As a DevOps engineer, do I know how to add another node to something? Sure. SRE, sure. But usually it's why you're doing something, right? I know how to add it, but I don't know why. I'm just getting told to add something versus we know exactly the scientific reason. We have metrics, we have traces, we have logs. This is the SRE side, to make a certain decision. So it goes back to expertise. Are the hard skills the same? Sure, why not? But are the science behind what they do? They're two different problem sets. So it's kind of hard. And this is where you get into it's the job description's too wide. It's too many moving parts. You're expecting too much from somebody, and that person's going to be unhappy.
So in a way it is overlapping, and you mean to say the hard skills are more or less the same. It's the purpose is what the difference is, right?
Yeah, again, so I'll give you an example. So as a DevOps engineer, you focus on infrastructure automation. So the SRE might not focus on the automation portion. Like they'll execute the automation, saying, you know what, we need to call this again, but they'll focus more on the science portion of it. Okay, why is uptime failing versus the DevOps engineer will be like, you know what, we'll just recreate something for you. So it's a hard nuance, right? Like every single firm views it differently. Some DevOps engineers I talk to get upset, like, oh, we do that in our job. Like on Reddit, I got flack, and it's like, look, everybody does it different. This is what I've seen. In my professional experience, this is where I think the line in the sand is, and you're either doing too much in your job, you need to pay you more, or it's hard for the hiring manager also, like depending on the organization, like how much they want to get out of somebody.
Got it. So in this case, a recruiter needs to understand the nuances. It's not that they should not go just with the hard skills, right? So trying to understand what exactly they're expecting this guy to do once he comes on board, right? What kind of role he should have played maybe in his previous organization. So these are the details I think the recruiters need to understand from the hiring manager, rather than just going with the designation or with just the hard skills which they throw it as keywords, right? So that right. So once that understanding is there, I think the conversation also which they are able to hold with the candidate can make a difference, and then say, okay, this guy is a DevOps guy or a SRE guy, right? So I think that's where sitting down with the hiring manager makes a lot of difference. What do you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Just motivation for why you're hiring. It could be any job. It could be a finance job. It could be, any job. It's just why are you hiring? Yeah.
Yeah. So coming to this two segments of DevOps, one is Dev and the Ops, right? Coming to these two segments, can you help us understand? Let's say a guy who is more inclined towards the Dev side of it, right? A DevOps guy who's more inclined towards the Dev side of it. What all he will do other than the CI/CD, the pipeline? What else is his metrics, or what else is his KRAs?
Yeah. So a successful DevOps team will have a mix of both sets of people, because, for example, my background's been in dev, right? So I solve a problem differently than someone who's been in operations. Where it manifests itself as a software engineer, I'm used to doing things over and over. Like I'm used to not getting it right the first time. So there's just a key difference between what a developer does and an operations engineer does. If you ever watched anybody write software, it is the exercise of iteration. Means that if you watched me, watch me write a piece of software, I try things like 50 times, right? Like you might think I'm stupid. Like I try it, write one or two lines, I try it, write another couple lines, and I do that all day, right? Until I have a complete set of instructions that works. And versus someone in operations, they have to get it right the first time, because if they don't, things will crash, right? Like there's no testing in production. Production's production. So operations folks always do in production. They want to limit iteration versus myself. It's like, we'll get it right eventually. Like we just keep. But it's core to innovation work to keep trying, right? Like no one gets it right the first time. They're full of shit if they get it right the first time. So, and so it's how it plays itself out, right? Like I see successful teams have both sets of people. It's because like the team is under the same KPIs or OKRs or pick your metrics, like. It's just how people are solving the problem, right? So it's up to the manager to understand that part of my team dynamic is I need someone who's more skilled in this, I need someone who's more skilled in that, and then the team will kind of cross learn, right? This is why my 60% came back up, because clearly people will bring something net new to the team that we don't have, and so they will hopefully cross train each other. I don't think there's any sort of different. So to your question, I don't think there's any different set of metrics that somebody who came from a dev background go to DevOps versus the operations part. They're solving the same problem, but they're having two different approaches usually that they take. So that's team dynamics that comes into play.
And their KPIs will be slightly different, right? A guy from the ops side, his KPIs will be different from a guy from the dev side, right? So that, can you help us understand what are the difference of the KPIs between both ends?
Yeah. So take DevOps out of the picture. So with DevOps, they're under the same KPIs. But if they were coming, so if looking at a software engineer, right, and a system engineer who's the operation side, so two sets. A typical KPI, of a software engineer in a good place would be having features delivered, right? Saying, hey, you know what? going to Agile, are you completing your work in the allotted story points? So for those who don't know what story points are, it's like these fake pieces of currency that you help estimate work. And so it's like, are you able to, commit to, do you have ability to what you forecast you deliver, right? And that's it, right? So then there's a whole bunch of math behind it. The typical KPIs for an operations person would be uptime. Like, hey, are you able to, and cost too, right? Like, hey, are you able to fulfill the infrastructure needs that we have in a stable way? Also, are you able to fulfill it in a cost-effective way? As a developer, I don't care too much about cost. It's like we wrote it. Clearly, the infrastructure people will help optimize that. And so, but again, going back to, I focus on, as a software engineer, I focus on change, right? Like I am incentivized to make change. The operations person is not incentivized to make change. Change causes problems to uptime. And so this is where the two schools, this is why DevOps is here, because they're two sets of people with they're moving at different paces. So, but I have to understand that you need to work together, right? So that's where they kind of overlap.
When we talk about DevOps today, is it mandatory that this guy needs to come with a cloud background, cloud exposure, or even on-premise would do in this case?
Again, it goes back to the firm, right? So it's every company is different because every company has a different footprint. So when I say footprint, some companies might be all in the public cloud. Some companies might be partially in the public cloud. Some companies might not be in the public cloud. And so it just depends on where they are. Clearly, for us, we're in two cloud vendors. We're in Azure and Google, or GCP, Google Cloud Platform. So when we hire, they need to have experience on one or the other because it wouldn't make sense to learn both, right? There'll be a struggle for that. And so it just depends on where, that's a core requirement. That's fair to ask, hey, we're and it's part of telling the story, hey, we're in AWS. You can learn more about this here, or we're looking to expand into other clouds. It's all part of the job description, getting the candidate excited about the role.
Okay, and who sets up the system architecture? Is it the DevOps guy or a software architect who sets up the system architecture, right? And before going there, can you help the audience understand what is system architecture basically? Because I believe not many would know it. So can you help us understand what is system architecture and who plays a role there, whether it's a DevOps guy or a backend developer, who plays a role there?
Yeah, system architecture, it's kind of a big one, right? So clearly, as an engineer, you just don't write things for no reason, right? You're working towards a goal. You're building something that needs to be built. You're all kind of marching to the same beat, and usually that kind of falls into, we have all these scaffoldings and moving pieces that we need to put together, and so system architecture would be a design, right? So system architecture is design. Architects in general focus on design and standards, right? And so typically you would say an architect is a more senior role, right, than an engineer, because architects set standards and they do design. And so they might say, to build this next calculator app, we need to make sure that our users can get to it. We need to make sure that we handle a certain scale. We need to make sure that we have, we play nice in other applications and widgets, right? And so they would kind of facilitate, brokering like patterns between different teams. And so it's just so depending on what you're building, if you're a really small company and you only have one DevOps engineer, congratulations, that DevOps engineer is building the system. He or she owns the architecture because they're building it. There's no one else telling them what they need. Versus if you work in a really big place, let's say you work for an investment bank or a bank or something, there's hundreds of architects there, right? So it depends on, for myself, I work at a small startup. So pretty much everything that I build, it's all me. I do the design. I talk to the stakeholders. I build it. I make sure it's implemented. I maintain it, right? And so that's where size matters at that point. If we were bigger and there's other things that I had to do, I can go to another team and do it. So Yeah, architecture design. There's not a hard connective tissue between an SRE, an architect. Now they all might come together as experts, right? In a typical fashion, it would be they're all experts. As let's say, as a chief architect, right? I will need to go and talk to our SRE team and say, you know what, this is what is required. Are we architecting it correctly for reliability? I might go to the DevOps team saying, you know what, are we able to play with our platform, and also are we allowing changes to enter the platform fast enough? So there's a lot of, it's going back to the expertise job description. If it's small, they're their own architect. If they're big, they're experts in parts of the puzzle.
Yeah, so it depends on the size of the organization. If it is a more like a startup, I think one guy would play the entire role and he would own the entire piece. But if it's a bigger organization, then there are expertise like people in the SRE, people from a chief architect, a DevOps guy who's involved here, right? Okay.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, cool. So, can you help us understand the difference between the architectures? Like today, microservice is a buzzword, right? Now, before microservices, there is SOA. SOA is more or less similar to microservice, but today microservice is more of a buzzword. And then you have this monolithic architecture, right? So, what is the difference between monolithic, SOA, and microservice, right? What is the difference between this?
Yeah. So like, there's always these technology is cyclical, like I'm actually more pessimistic about some of the other design patterns, but in quintessentially, if you go back a decade or more ago, this monolithic means one, right? So mono is one, and so the application itself was all encompassing. So going back to our cell phone here, so a monolith would be the entire phone, right? So if I had to make a change to the calculator app, I would have to reinstall all of iOS, right? Because it's a monolith, and so it means that even though you're making small little changes, the whole application goes. And there's pros and cons to that design pattern, right? Like it's easy to deploy. There's only one iOS, right? Versus I got to go to the App Store and get the calculator. I got to go to App Store and get Google Maps. Like depending on the application, right? Now there's some inherent challenges with that. For example, if you're just making one change, why are you installing everything all over again, right? It's kind of heavy to do that. And so this is where the microservice model starts to come in. So microservices, it's been going on since the dawn of time, right? Like it's called decomposing the application. So now you have a calculator app. Now you have Google Maps. Now you have all sorts. You have WhatsApp. You have all these other like applications that you have, and you have smaller pieces that can go independently of each other, right? And so by breaking parts down, you're able to make changes faster to certain things, and also you're able to scale things differently. Let's say, it's my calculator is easy, but Google Maps takes a lot of firepower, so you can scale independently from the entire like self-running application, right? It has brought complexity with it. Remember, when you're deploying only one thing, it's only one. But with a microservice, every little service is deployable. So this is why there's a need for more DevOps engineers. Because going back to like, if you only had one deployable unit, there's only so many times you can deploy, right? Versus you have thousands of deployable units all through the day. Yeah, you want to.
These guys comes in now. The DevOps guy comes in the microservice case. If I'm not wrong, is that?
Yeah, there's usually like a pretty close correlation to that, because as you have more to deploy, it will really tax what you did before. And so deployment complexity skyrockets with microservices. So you're doing more deployments, you have to orchestrate deployments, there's order of operations you have to take care of. And so you need a good pipeline, right, to do that. And that's where a DevOps engineer.
Is it right to say that if a company is hiring more DevOps folks, that means they are more microservice driven in terms of architecture? Is it right to say?
I would say sure. Like there has to be a need. Like this goes back to why are they hiring? Are you hiring someone to do infrastructure automation? Is that really a DevOps engineer? No, that's a system engineer. You're just slapping the title on to get more candidates in the pool. Shame on them. But yeah, For true DevOps, I would say, yeah, like that's what a lot of the need would come from, right? Like we're doing more deployments, and also there's no right or wrong way, like to both design patterns have their pros and cons. There's lots of organizations that have both, right? Like I would say, no one organization has one pattern that they support. So
yeah, but let's say majorly, let's say maybe on the majority of the side, right? People who are hiring DevOps, that means majorly they are more microservice inclined. Is it right to say? There can be exceptions, but let's take the majority.
well, hard to tell, but I would say sure. Like
You did mention, because you did mention microservice is a thing. The architecture itself is like that. You need more DevOps people to manage because there's a lot of deployment happening and all that, right? So since that correlation you derived it, so that's why I'm trying to understand, so that this will help recruiters to say, okay, they're hiring DevOps folks, maybe they are more microservice inclined.
Yeah, I think that's fair. As part of like when you're talking to the hiring manager, going back to the why are you hiring, the hiring manager might say, you know what, at XYZ Bank, they might even tell you that we're moving to public cloud and microservices, so our pipeline is really important, and we're rebuilding it, or we're starting from scratch, and so yeah, like, but again. As a DevOps engineer, I don't care that you use microservices, right? Like this is the other way. I'm talking from a candidate perspective now. It's not exciting to me either way, right? Like I'm not excited because I don't care. It's a design pattern. What I care about is what problem I'm gonna get to solve. Like, oh, you need to increase your deployment pipeline by 100%, like 100x. That sounds cool. Let me try to do that. Versus we're using microservices again. It's not a sexy thing for me. This is my opinion, right?
It's all about the task in hand, right? If the task in hand is like crazy enough, then it's not about microservice. Even Monolith can excite a DevOps guy. If it is like they have to deal with 100x deployment, I think Monolith also will be exciting. On the other hand, if it is microservice, but there is nothing much in task in hand, that may not be exciting for a DevOps.
That's a perfect way of saying it. Yeah. So.
Okay, and how about this SOA, right? So there was a lot of buzz of SOA, I think like 7 years back or something, but now there's not much buzz about SOA. What is this SOA architecture?
SOA architecture is service-oriented architecture. So like a lot of, again, it's a pattern, right? So it's SOA was brought about by a few vendors like IBM and several other vendors. It was kind of the march towards microservices. So there's underlying there's a very textbook definition of a microservice that most people don't follow, right? Like there's an extremely textbook version of it that people just call it a movement now. And when the pattern was first described, there were very stringent ways, like you have copies of the data everywhere. It's message based. It's atomic. That's beyond the conversation, right? But SOA, it's a series. It's a true SOA. If it's from a vendor standpoint, it's a series of principles and a series of I would say policies. So, for example, it's a way of wiring services together. For example, if we have again going back to our phone, if we have Google Maps and Apple Maps, right? How do they communicate with the GPS on my phone, right? So there's a GPS service on my phone, which is independent of Apple Maps and Google Maps. How do they communicate? How do they recognize each other, right? How do they, when you click and hold something, open in Google Maps, open in Apple Maps, what type of contract do they have between each other? So it's really a couple of key terms. Discoverability of each service. How do they know about each other? Also registering the services. How do they how do you know you have Apple Maps and Google Maps on your phone? But SOA is an old pattern, right? Like no one talks about SOA anymore. SOA was vendor-led in the mid 2000s, early 2010s. And if anybody's looking for SOA, they're living in the past at this point.
Today, it's either monolith or microservice, right? It's anyone today.
I mean, those are design patterns. It's where you would see people bring up SOA is more for software engineering, right? Because if they're saying, you know what, we need someone with SOA skills, they're probably supporting an old platform, right? So they might be supporting a platform that was built in 2008 or 2010, and it's in the maintenance phase. And so it's more for a software engineer. A DevOps engineer in Sre will never hear the word SOA. They'll be like, what? What's that?
Okay, cool. And then what is this infrastructure as a code? Let's say, for example, Terraform. What is this all about?
Yeah, so there's this whole category of software called IAC, or infrastructure as code, and going back to it's going back to like the DevOps movement. Like both sides of the table are, everyone's looking like software engineers these days, because going back to typical operations engineers, they don't like iteration. Like they have to get it right the first time. But what infrastructure as code has given, so these terms like Terraform or Ansible or Chef or Puppet, they're ways of describing what needs to happen on your machine. So going back to, remember the first time, let's say you got a brand new computer and you open it up and you have to go install, Chrome and Firefox, and you install the Office suite. Sure, but remember, that was you clicking on things, right? What infrastructure as code does, because again, how do you maintain 1,000 machines? How do you maintain 10,000 machines? Basically, infrastructure as code is that it's a definition of saying, you know what, for any Mac we have, install Office, install Chrome, install Firefox, and provision those in order, and it would go and do its thing. And so it's basically the infrastructure. So infrastructure could be compute, it can be storage, it can be anything that the application needs to run, right? So like anything on your computer, basically, is provisioning that in a certain way. Now, you might oversimplifying it because we're using consumer software like Windows or Mac, right? Which is, but usually it's, but for any sort of enterprise, they're running like Linux, and so you have to be very like, even installing like a Wi-Fi adapter or like a networking driver, like there's differences between a whole bunch of them. So you have to give a really, really tight prescription on what you need. I need this type of networking adapter. I need this type of storage. I need this package for the application to work. It's just building all those into recipes and executing them. And so it's really that. I mean, that's super core to any DevOps shop. It's having some sort of ISC skill.
Okay. One last question around this DevOps SRE. Let's say, for example, if you're hiring a DevOps guy, right, or a SRE guy, vice versa, anything, will you be cool to look at a resume? Let's say if you're hiring DevOps, will you be cool to talk to a candidate whose designation is SRE from his previous role, or vice versa? Maybe you're hiring for a SRE and the previous designation of the candidate is DevOps engineer. Will you be cool? Because these are the challenges which recruiters generally face. When they're hiring for SRE, the hiring manager says, no, don't get me a guy whose designation is DevOps, right? And vice versa, right? So what is your take on this when you're hiring for this kind of?
It really depends on the org. So if it was like the first hire, I would say that SRE trumps DevOps engineer, right? So if I was trying to hire my first SRE, I would need someone who's skilled, like I need someone who's skilled in the science of reliability engineering, because we're needing that. Versus like if I'm hiring like my 50th SRE, much more attuned to grow and train somebody who has the skill set. Now, for a DevOps engineer, if I was hiring my first DevOps engineer, I would absolutely hire at SRE. Like, there's no question, because their skills they have overlapping skills, but they're more scientific. Like they can back off some of the science. Right? They have the expertise.
You mean to say you place SRE above DevOps? That's how you say?
Yeah, I get crap for that. But if you look at how much they get paid, an SRE gets paid more than a DevOps engineer. Why? Supply and demand and skill set, right? So that's typically how it is. Now there's people parading around that they're both, but they just want a higher annual salary or hourly rate. But going back to, I know several SRE organizations, that have 1% or like 30 people, right? And it's the more they're willing to train people, because there's not that many of both, right? There's not that many SREs out there. There's not that many DevOps engineers out there. There's a huge glut. And so the ability to cross-train, easy. As a hiring manager, again, going back to my first one, I would try to stick to someone with similar experience.
Okay, so you would probably prefer in that case SRE over DevOps, right? But there are certain scenarios wherein designations don't really play a key role, right? Wherein a guy calls himself DevOps, maybe he does a job of SRE.
Yeah, because these titles are like new, right? So you could kind of tell, like, again, what are you hiring for? Are you hiring for infrastructure automation? Are you hiring for reliability? Are you hiring for scaling? Like security? Like what are you hiring for? And so the titles changed. Like, like how someone who would have been a software engineer said, you know what, I helped this application scale to 1 million users. They would make a really good SRE. Like they would really, really, really make a good one because they helped, they were there. Like, because again, like there's their experience of what they did is not pigeonholed to a job title, right? So, and these titles are new. So,
if you have to put it in simple words, someone who has seen the scale and the reliability could be a good fit for SRE. A guy who is more done the automation side of it, the infrastructure automation or the ops automation will be a good fit for DevOps, right? If you have to put it in simple words.
Yeah. Because typically, like, who goes for a DevOps job is it operations engineer. Who goes for a SRE job is a software engineer, right? And so, like, that's typically
Okay.
both of them, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So thanks, Ravi. I think this was really helpful for us to get some insights in terms of understanding DevOps as a role and the roles around DevOps like SRE and understand build and release and the other segments whatever we discussed in terms of the DevOps and how DevOps as a role evolved and we discussed microservice architecture, right? So this was very helpful and I think recruiters would have got a lot of takeaways from this and I think this would help them in terms of their day-to-day recruiting activity, be it decoding the job description or engaging with the candidates in terms of the DevOps candidates, right? So thanks everyone for tuning in for this particular series and thanks Ravi for joining us and giving your time and your insights around DevOps. I think that has helped us derive some good inputs which will help us in our recruiting activity. Thanks Ravi. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Yeah. Have a great night, everybody.
You too. Have a great day.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.